Yes, welcome to Dilated Peoples of the Caribbean, Part 16. I believe this is going to be the first episode regarding African Dilated Peoples of the Caribbean. Right, so here we are, the African Dilated Peoples of the Caribbean. In the first episode, what I'm going to go into is the drivers behind as to why the dilated peoples of, or the black African diaspora were put into slavery, or how they ended up in the Caribbean, right? We're going to look at the Europeans, their first contact, what may have happened in regard to that, but then also what may have been going on in Africa long before the Europeans got there that would have contributed to slavery and the transportation of their fellow countrymen, citizen, or tribesmen, as it would have been called back then. Anyway, let's get into this right now. The facilitation of the slave trade could never be enacted without complicity. Sub-Saharan Africa in some ways had been left isolated by the natural defence of the Sahara and the Sahel respectively, acting as the skeletal barrier of protection for the heartland of Africa. Dating back to antiquity, north of the Sahara, Africa had suffered many violent invasions on a revolving basis. At some stage, a culture of slavery had been introduced to the continent. Slave routes were first forged through the sub-Saharan lands to the coastal northern and eastern areas, as well as the Horn of Africa, where Nubians, Abyssinians, Ethiopians, and finally, chronologically, black Africans were to be sold at market into slavery and be transported akin to livestock chattel destined for the Eurasian landmass. Right, so regarding slavery, in one form or another, it's been around for thousands of years, depending on what you want to call it. Whoever would have built the pyramids most probably would have been slaves as well, you know. And for whatever reason, there were slave routes, one down the west side, one down the sort of middle, and one towards the east. Slave routes that were forged or developed over sort of the last 1,500 years that would have burrowed deep into the central cavity of Africa. And obviously many black Africans would have been taken through these routes for like over 1,000 years, right? Now, I don't really want to go into that because that's a story for another issue, so I'm not going to go into it too deeply. But, you know, you've got the Sahara, which is a desert. Below there, you've got like a belt of land, which I'm just learning a little bit about just recently in the last year or two, called the Sahel. And it's like a breadbasket of Africa. A lot of food and agriculture goes on within this region, but it's between the sort of desert and the sort of heartland of Africa's people, right? So you can imagine over time, over evolution, whatever, it's acted as a bit of a barrier from the rest of the world. So where like the north may have been going on like sort of invasion after invasion of like Persians, Greeks, Romans, whatever, going backwards and forwards, fighting for the land, Africa was pretty much left isolated, apart from when these slave routes or these trading routes were opened up. So you could say pretty much they were allowed to sort of not be party to what was going on in the rest of the world. And that's why some of the tribes are just as remote as what the tribes were in South America when people got to the Amazon, you know. But anyway, let's move on. A prisoner of war, in the westernized modern-day view, has the right of codified international law. However, an unwritten rule of conflict would be to nullify the enemy from posing a premeditated threat. The brutal spoils of war gave way to the system of polygamy, which subsequently created an ill-fated surplus male population. There were signs of a slave economy prior to recorded European contact in the 1400s. African tribes, when shuffling order of supremacy under the agenda of internal affairs, often post-war the victorious tribe would imprison subjects that was placed in subjugation. The preschool for becoming mature slaves for adoption and to be well kept as an individual would be made vulnerable to perishable scavenger feed. At this epoch, African aristocrats were often financially and socially evaluated on the protrusion of their potbellies, alongside how many slaves were under their command as a port of currency. Domestic servitude had served recognition by those with older slave roots, and so captured queens of Sheba alongside felines of Menelik, the son of Solomon, a direct descendant of His Majesty Haile Selassie, were of high value as opposed to males of adult age that may have been endangered. They would in turn have the pain of unworthiness slightly alleviated with the arrival of European traders full of enthusiasm for labour-intensive vacancies in the plantations and fields of the Americas. Right, so where do we go with that? So, according to extracts that I've read in documentaries, etc., there was a surplus population within Africa, male population, because, in warfare, what they would do, they would imprison the tribe that they were against, or the group that they're against, all of the men, and they'd either cull them, eliminate them, or they would transfer them into the system of slavery. Sometimes they'd become part of the family, but they would be subjugated and they would live under whoever it is they were conquered by. On top of that, before European contact, there was a heavy demand for domestic servitude, sort of east of Africa. So the women of the east, especially the eastern side of Africa, were used for domestic servitude for way before before European contact, yeah. So, the males were never wanted. They were like surplus. They were just there, imprisoned, and no life basically, yeah. And they would be eventually killed because they're not part of the tribe that has conquered them, right? So with the Europeans now entering the fray, it opened up the availability for a male population to be shipped out of Africa en masse, which is what was to happen in the next few hundred years. Anyway, let's move on. African society at the time had a surplus vulnerable population, insecure from abduction of citizens that were undervalued as they could be utilised in the field of agriculture instead of refuged as a livestock commodity. At some point, after the first encounters with Europeans, African tribal leaders hungry for the white man's goods and especially his weapons of destruction, which stood in excess of shield and spear, would be top of the bartering list, were the bargaining chips that established movement of the first African peoples to be transported somewhere they would never be seen again. Out of sight, out of mind, ports sprung up along the west central and southeastern parts of the continent, where an exchange for industrial manufactured goods had been agreed in exchange for extracted vessels of blood diamond Africans to be separated from their home, to be separated from their tribe, and to be ousted from their natural environments. See, really and truly, at first it boiled down to trade, novelty, and the want for European material. What they'd come to with the African aristocracy or the African leadership, they wanted in high abundance, especially weapons, which I say is obsolete, because I'm thinking they wouldn't have sold them the newest of weapons. They would have sold them their obsolete weapons and given them their obsolete weapons, which were in excess, as I like to say, of shield and spear. You know, these people at that time, they weren't ready for the weapons that Europeans had. They never had the social maturity. They never had the society, the prison systems, the government. They never had none of that infrastructure. They would have just been handed weapons even back then, and you would have had to have joined the weapons race whether you liked it or not. Because if you didn't, the tribe next door would have had those European weapons, and you would have needed to defend yourself. So the introduction of weapons to Africa, do you know what I mean? It's left a real, a real lasting effect to this day. But it was all about trade, and eventually, it would open up to people too. Anyway, let's move on. By the 1700s, what had become a feasible way of cleansing the enemy had become the mineral component that was integral to the magical arrival of European manufactured goods craved by Africans in power. The receipt of obsolete weaponry would have played a major role in procurement of demand for African subjects, as this would enable expansion and guard threat from tribal neighbours, as the concept of countries was a European jurisdictional paradigm. Involuntarily, Africans were naively plunged into racial betrayal by creating an economy dictated by outside influences that relied on literally devouring their own. In consolation, many Africans were hunted without warning deep into the centre mass of the continent and marched to the closest port where European slave ships could transport them over the horizon. What would have been the faults of those Africans that indulged in slave catching, not to mention the faults of the recently abducted free African? So what I always think this as I'm reading, what would have been the thoughts at those times of the African slave catchers that were catching their own, but also those that were being shipped? What would they have been thinking all throughout their time, especially the people that were captured, who would have been my ancestor? They wouldn't have been informed in no way, shape or form. At least the Indians and the Asians, Chinese, they were informed. They would have some idea. Well, they would have no idea, but yeah, they just had completely no idea from this place to the next. Real harrowing and scary times from the moment of capture right up until you get taken to a port, and then from the port you're shipped on a boat that's diseased and anyway, we're going to go into this, right? So let's not go too into it just yet, right? But yeah, I always think to myself, man, deeply, like, what were these people thinking? How were they feeling? It's just like, it's good, it's sobering, yeah. But there was a tribe I was reading, like, in Benin. I believe it's the Dahomey, right? And they sort of fell away economically after slavery was abolished, and economically their business was going into the interior of Africa, into the Congo, and drawing people out of there to be filtered into the system of slavery. It's not often mentioned and said, but yeah, people would have to run into the interior or abscond or whatever it is into the interior, but then they'd be fetched back and taken to the coast and shipped out, And that was a business for some African tribes. And also, I just wanted to go on and say, like, this concept of countries it's a European pastime, it's a European concept put upon Africans. I'm guessing real borders are tribal, which could say translates to country, but it's more along the lines of tribal, when that sometimes causes conflict now, because some countries have tribes fighting over land because it's tribal. It's not just you draw a line in the sand. Land is by tribal. So sometimes they won't recognize the country because the country maybe doesn't subscribe to their tribe, and it's all about tribal ancestry, which is how it went back then, and which is how it should really be, right? Even in Europe, there's tribes, But anyway, that's another story altogether. Let's move on. Economics often foreshadows commitment to conscience. African slave catchers inextricably linked to systemic decision by leadership that would have been generationally forced to participate in a conveyor belt of evil would have probably felt they would have had little choice but to continue trade to meet demand, but not yet understanding that Africa was being depleted and depopulated of a commodity of people that, under terms of peace with a social working structure to refine horsepower without being sold, would eventually have secured an industrial machine so mighty it could have potentially put Africa in a position of economic superpower, with Europe and Asia dreaming of importation of their own vessels to Africa. Arguably, slave manpower was harnessed by Europeans in the warehouse of the Americas on relatively small plantations. Had Africa, at the very least, developed a sustainable working society model with the use of slave currency not allowed to leave the continent, could have led to the detriment of the whole Eastern Hemisphere outside of Africa. Could it be that with the Europeans discovering a new world, coupled with transportation advantages that upon navigation of the globe beyond that of their counterparts, fostered the opportunity that only those who voyaged the seven seas could envisage? Maybe they were able to visualize a workforce that may have been wasting chattel in Africa had the potential to output. So this is a question that I ask myself along this journey, right? What if at the time Africa had some type of working societal model? We take it for granted, but there's a working model within Europe. There's business, and the business is structured, where you're the worker, then you're middle management, and then you're a boss, and then to a boss you're an owner, an aristocrat, so on and so forth. Had that type of system been floor planned in widespread Africa, could it have developed some type of working class system where people that were at least enslaved were transferred into some type of work that would have been for the Africans? Those people that left and went to the Americas, imagine if they were filtered into some type of industrialized working system instead of allowed to leave the continent. Imagine even if the British never left the continent and developed that within Africa, what would the world look like now? Could you imagine the whole world needing to emigrate to Africa in order to work economically? Is what it could have been. But then, to me, the rest of the world would have been starving, and everyone would need to come here, and you could starve the rest. That's what I think. So maybe it can't always go like that. But can you imagine if there was some type of working model for these? Because no matter what, there was a surplus population. The Europeans had the foresight. We can use this manpower. The Africans don't know that we've got another landmass. And to be honest with you, the plantations in relation to landmass, they're quite small. They're small operations on another side of the world, sparsely populated in comparison to the Eastern Hemisphere, right? And they were able to make so much off of it. Could you imagine if this was all kept in-house, people weren't allowed to leave, and there was some type of cohesion that transferred people into work? But obviously you need a system, like a good education system, a good judicial system, which Europeans would have had. Some type of order some type of societal order that allows the mechanism of workers at the bottom to just at least work. Whether it's slavery. If it's slavery, it's slavery. If it's not, it's working, right? But either way, they would have been churning and producing for Africa. And could you imagine what the world would look like? I know. I just know that I could see instead of the emigration and people wanting to come to Europe, the whole world would need to be magnetized towards Africa, and Africa would be like the place to be, and there would be no need for like export because it's got a lot of stuff that it doesn't need to. Yeah, but yeah, it just makes my mind ponder and marvel sometimes about like if they just had some type of working model or knew how to put people to work. The leadership knew how to get the best out of their people, manpower, instead of just imprisoning people and offloading them because they're an enemy tribe. If they were able to somehow facilitate the working class system, what would it have looked like? What would a country as big as Ghana or Nigeria have looked like if the millions that they allowed to leave were somehow put into some type of working class system? What would they have produced for the world industry-wise in the time of the industrial age? What could they have done if they never let those people go that facilitated the industrial, that were the vital cog of the trade triangle for the Europeans? What would have happened is all I like to think about now and again. Anyway, that concludes this episode of Dilated Peoples of the Caribbean. I hope you've enjoyed it. There's more to come. Look out for the barefoot Kojo. I hope you've been enjoying the whole series thus far. And once again, deliver this message straight to your heart because it's from mine. All good. Take care. Love to all. Bless. Love. One.